Good morning. I'm Faria Nasruddin, Middle East Program Associate here at the Wilson Center, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's panel on the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda in the Middle East and North Africa. This year, 2025, marks the 25th anniversary of the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which acknowledged the disproportionately adverse effects of conflict on women and girls, and called for the meaningful participation of women in negotiations and peace-building processes, ensuring lasting and inclusive peace for all. Studies show that including women in structured peace negotiations increases the likelihood of it lasting at least 2 years by 20%, and for 15 years by a remarkable 35%. Yet, in the Middle East, where women are leading already in their local communities, they are noticeably absent from formal negotiating tables. Today, we have an incredible lineup of speakers, of panelists, to discuss the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda with insights from their work and from on the ground. And without further ado, I'm honored to introduce them. We have Huda Abu Arkoub, the Palestine Country Director at Search for Common Ground, Jihan El-Hadidi, the Middle East and North Africa Policy Associate at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, Marie Fostier, the Senior Advisor at the European Institute of Peace, and last but not least, Maya Severe, the Israel Country Director at Search for Common Ground. I'd like to get right into the discussion and start today with Jihan, who will give us a big picture overview of the region and lay out some of the groundwork for our discussion today. Jihan, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security has a WPS index, which scores and ranks countries in terms of women's inclusion, justice, and security. Could you outline for us what trends we're seeing in the Middle East and North Africa region according to this tracker? Is women's inclusion, justice, and security trending positively in the region, or is it taking more of a downturn?
Thank you, Faria, very much for inviting me to this distinguished panel to discuss this very critical topic, and allow me to express my deep appreciation to the Wilson Center for bringing this issue to the forefront and for recognizing the importance of this occasion. This year indeed is a moment of reflection. It is an opportunity to assess what has worked and what has not worked globally, and especially in the Middle East and North Africa region, where we have layers of challenges that undermine the effective implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. We have entrenched patriarchal norms, protracted conflicts, and intersecting crises, all of which marginalize women and make their contributions and potential extremely undervalued. However, this is also an opportunity to advocate for reforms, to fix outdated frameworks, and to bridge the gap between women's very rich expertise on the grassroots level, which you mentioned in your opening remarks, and the representation in track one diplomacy, which is not as strong as it should be. Regarding the Women, Peace, and Security Index, and to give the audience a bit of a background, this is an index that provides a comprehensive framework to measure women's status across three crucial dimensions: justice, security, and inclusion. This index integrates more than 20 indicators that connect women's conditions to broader development and security concerns. The 2023-2024 index covers 177 countries and societies, and it is not just a valuable measure of the status of women, but it is also a useful tool to track trends, guide policymakers, and hold governments accountable for their promises to advance women's rights and opportunities. The index also makes a strong empirical case for the link between these crucial dimensions and the overall well-being of society. And it confirms that women's well-being is not just a moral imperative, but it is a security necessity. Societies that marginalize women are more prone to conflict, instability, and poor governance. If we take a closer look at the Middle East region in the index, unfortunately, the region does not trend positively. In fact, the region performs third worst overall. But it has the widest range of performance. There's the United Arab Emirates in the 22nd place globally, and there's Yemen in the 176th place. Three countries in the region have consistently appeared in the bottom dozen countries since the inaugural index in 2017, 2018. These are Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, which is probably not a very surprising finding given the ongoing instability in these countries for many years. The region also performs lowest in terms of women's access to justice, and it has the highest levels of discrimination against women in legal frameworks. On other indicators like inclusion, for example, the region on average falls far below the global mean in women's economic participation, which indicates a structural barrier to inclusion. Several countries in the region have laws that allow child marriage. Several countries also still do not have criminal penalties for sexual harassment in the workplace. And we have seen justice systems unable to protect and support the survivors of gender-based violence in many cases. And there are so many other factors that contribute to diminishing security of women, such as intimate partner violence, the high levels of exposure to exploitation, abuse, and trafficking, especially in displaced communities, as well as the proximity to conflict, as millions of women live in very close proximity to conflict in the region. There are also cases of political violence targeting women. In 2022, there were 240 cases of political violence targeting women in the region. We have seen armed groups and rebel groups targeting women advocates, and in some cases, women have been exposed to kidnappings and torture and other forms of discrimination and abuse. So in general, the region is not on a very positive trajectory when it comes to women's peace and security, given the widespread conflicts and cycles of violence. And unfortunately, there are so many gaps and challenges that require immediate attention from the different stakeholders.
Thank you for that overview, Jihan. It's, distressing to hear about a lot of the barriers and challenges to WPS in the region. But you touched on, I think, some very important points, namely proximity to conflict, which we're seeing, some relative de-escalation after the past year and a half with openings in Syria and Israel and Palestine as well. But I'd like you to zoom in a little bit. I know that the GWIPS, the Institute, has, in addition to the index, a new tracker that tracks these conflict countries that are either at risk, currently experiencing, or transitioning away from armed conflict. In the region, the tracker outlines Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And so kind of shifting a bit more to the opportunities, what would you say are the current challenges and then now the windows of opportunities for implementing greater access to justice and inclusion in these contexts? And kind of a second question to that is, are there similarities across these case studies, or do you feel that each of them presents sort of a unique set of circumstances?
Definitely, yeah. The tracker monitors and analyzes conflicts from a women, peace, and security lens. And recently, it identified 13 armed conflicts around the world as the most watched conflicts in 2025, and 6 of them are in the Middle East region. In terms of common challenges or common characteristics, there are, of course, common angles between these conflicts, on top of which is that women are the ones who usually bear the brunt. They are the first victims of violence, unfortunately. We see also, for example, climate change emerging as a threat multiplier in many contexts, whether it is climate-induced displacement or environmental degradation resulting from violent conflicts. In both cases, women are disproportionately impacted. And we see also, in terms of the positive side, is that women are active on the local level in all these contexts, despite the mounting challenges. But if we take a closer look at each country of them, of course, there are nuances to each context. In Israel, Palestine, for example, the ceasefire, of course, was a step forward. However, the team that negotiated the agreement earlier this year was an all-male team. Accordingly, the agreement lacked any comprehensive gender considerations. In Lebanon, we have not seen women meaningfully engaged in peace talks recently, despite their involvement in peace building at all levels in Lebanon. In Libya, we see the reintroduction of a public morality protection unit to enforce the compulsory veiling of women and girls over the age of 9. We see that women cannot travel without a male guardian. And these restrictions do not just curtail women's freedoms, but they increase their exposure to gender-based violence. And the problem with a country like Libya is that there's lesser attention on it right now as attention shifts to other deadly conflicts and areas of instability. However, there's an opportunity in Libya with the announcement in late December of a UN-facilitated peace process. And the initial announcement briefly mentioned women, and we are hopeful that women will be engaged in every stage of this process, especially that Libyan women have been instrumental in local mediation efforts for years. Syria is in the very early stages of a transition, which is unclear how it will evolve. There are still more questions than answers, but definitely there are concerns on how the political situation will evolve in the country and how the situation will look like for women. But there have been unconfirmed reports of women attacked for being seen in public with men they are not related to. However, transitional phases are always opportunities for women to engage in every aspect of rebuilding and reconstruction. So we have seen recently that the Syrian women's political movement, they held their first press conference in Damascus, and they announced a feminist political track for peace building and a strategic vision for Syria that includes some very progressive ideas on political inclusion, youth participation, healing and rebuilding. So hopefully the authorities in Syria will pay attention to that. Lastly, Sudan and Yemen, both countries are experiencing very alarming conditions for women. There are reports of widespread sexual violence in Sudan, difficulty in accessing aid. However, Sudanese women have remained at the front lines and they have participated in multiple convenings calling for ceasefires, protection of civilians, improving aid delivery. In Yemen, there are reports of food deprivation and increasing cases of cholera. Women make the majority of them. But there's an opportunity that the peace deal that was very close to happen last year is still not off the table. So this is an opportunity for women to engage, but there is no indication that their participation will be guaranteed. So it's a very complicated landscape with so many challenges and some openings for women to engage.
Thank you, Jihan. And on that note, you spoke a little bit about the ongoing opportunities that we have in track one, kind of formal negotiation levels, and highlighted ongoing grassroots organization. I'd like to shift to Marie now, who has experience in the track one negotiation and from a European perspective. Marie, what we see is that women, as Jihan highlighted, are actively involved in peace building at the local level. But could you provide, based on your experience, how their involvement in peace processes at the track one or diplomatic level, what does it look like?
Well, thank you, Faria. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the Wilson Center to organize this panel. Well, unfortunately, their involvement at the track one level is very, very limited. In the latest, and it was already a long time ago, negotiations, formal negotiations between the two parties, two Yemeni parties, there was only one woman at the table. And when there were negotiations between the Assad regime and the opposition, also years ago, 2018 or so, there was very few women on each side. So in the formal discussions at the track one level, women are usually left out. And the UN, for the processes in which they there are mediators, so namely Syria and or Syria until recently, and Yemen. The UN has created a mechanism to try to address this issue. So it's consultative mechanism. For Syria, it's called the Women Advisory Board, and for Yemen, it's called the Technical Advisory Group. So basically, the idea is to gather a group of women who can advise the UN Special Envoy on the negotiations. And to me, this triggers a number of concerns. First of all, just in terms of the conceptual point of view, it means like having women in a separate room, and you tell them, okay, discuss the issue, and we'll take what comes out of this, and we'll bring it to the real negotiators. So that's to me, that's patronizing, condescending, and really problematic. Second of all, there have been criticism about how these women have been selected, because it has been very opaque. So some of the advisory board for Syria was renewed last year, and it was more of an open procedure with an application process. So the UN office has made an effort on this, but until now, usually the procedure is having an opaque selection. And finally, the main structural issue with these advisory boards is that there is no transfer mechanism between the group and the negotiators. So no matter the ideas, the work women do and what they come up with, it is not meaningfully included and taken into account in the discussions of with the delegation. So that's why it is very limited in terms of addressing the lack of women at the table. And as you mentioned, there is a clear tension, because in Syria, in Yemen, women have been very active in peace building at the local level. In Syria, they have been involved in interfaith dialogue, for instance, at the local level. Some women have avoided separatism movement in some regions of Syria. In Yemen, Yemeni women have been extraordinarily active and proactive and involved at the local level, negotiating ceasefire to allow the evacuation of families stranded at the front line, negotiating access for humanitarian aid, supporting effort for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and also leading negotiations for the release of prisoners. So all this is not reflected into track one, and this is clearly a missed opportunity. So I think that's one of the main issues to address today, is how to fill this gap and how to find a way to link this local level and the track one level.
Thank you, Marie. That's, absolutely right. The current mechanisms and format that we have linking track one to women's efforts leaves these gaps that you've outlined there. And so Huda and also Maya, I'd like to get both your perspectives on this issue as kind of as practitioners. You're both involved in these local peace building efforts. And so in your extensive experience, please feel free, either one can take this question. How do you find that women are positioned, and why really are they best positioned to build the peace and lead these people-to-people connections on the local, and kind of escalating that to the track one level?
Okay, so Maya, is it okay to start? First of all, thank you so much for acknowledging the dire need for women's participation at Wilson Center. Jihan and Mary, both of you have given an overview of the status of women all over the world, I would assume, but because of the conflicts in the MENA region, there is now more talking about the women's role in peace building, in negotiations, in implementation of agreements, etc. Unfortunately, after the war on Gaza, we as practitioners in the field have witnessed a huge demand for women's perspective in policy circles. And I myself, I'm part of a number of policy circles, including the one that the European Institute is actually focused on. I had a call this morning with them, the Finnish government, the European government. Recently, the American government has been, asking for recommendations from women on the day after. And I have to say that it's one of the challenges that I'm facing is that we rarely find women who can come forward and do these recommendations. They have the skills, they have been part of the negotiation processes in the past. They still do not have enough protection to come forward. And I would bring back our concentration on the Article of Protection at the UN Resolution 1325. We need women to feel that they are secured enough in order to come forward and bring their feminist, inclusive political activism forward and recommendations forward. Women in conflict zones are the ones who are mostly paying the price because they are the ones who are losing their loved ones. In Gaza, we lost almost 13,000 women, not to mention the children in just 15 months. It's outrageous and unheard of. And we didn't have one international entity that is, willing to take the lead in order to protect women, let alone children or men who are not in combat. So I would say that one of the things that is an issue is not the lack of expertise, rather than the lack of security for women. The other obstacle I would mention is the economic obstacle. Women, in order for them to be free, they need to be independent, economically speaking. And every decision the men in the world are making, they are not taking into consideration women as a power for sustainable economic plans all over the world, including in the Middle East. And we see that there is also a trend, and unfortunately, this trend is among young women in the Arab world, is that let's stay home, accept the fact that our place is home, get education, get comfortable, finding a rich man and marry and do nothing. So this is the trend that we are witnessing in the Middle East, which was not, for instance, my mom's generation. My mom's generation was more socialist, more involved, going on all kinds of activism in order to prove their own willingness to reclaim their rights. So I would say that one of the recommendations I keep pushing in these circles is we need more women in the negotiation processes, and also we need more women in the implementation processes. And this is something that we are very keen about developing now, especially on the day after for Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you, Huda. Maya?
Thank you. Thank you, Faria. Thank you to the Wilson Center. This is indeed a very important moment for us to come together and discuss this. Marie, you mentioned the gap between the number of extraordinary, capable women at the local level and the lack of these women on formal peace talks. And Huda, you mentioned the younger generation, which is so different than that of our mothers, and also of ours. And I would like to suggest that maybe this gap that Marie discussed and outlined causes a lot of frustration, because there is a tradition, for instance, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is a tradition of track 2 led by women, amazing women on both sides, arriving at policy recommendations and actually suggesting solutions on the ground. But again and again, they are disregarded. There is something happens when the moment comes for these processes, for these recommendations, for these women to move from track 2 to track 1. And I think we should all, focus on this transition and see how we can help these women reach the track 1 circles, and hopefully the younger generation, the ones that Huda, you described, will feel that they have reason to, because as of now, when they see their mothers and their grandmothers, doing these processes and just not being able to influence, it's actually quite understandable why they would give up. On the opportunity side, I would just like to mention that I think that within this catastrophe that we're seeing, there must be an opportunity as well. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that more and more people are acknowledging outdated frameworks, which have been led by men, by generals, inflicting violence, and not only that, but also viewing the situation through militaristic eyes. I think if you open most of the television channels and also, many media outlets, the commentaries you would see are mainly men. This is true for Israel, it's true for Palestine. And I think also we need to focus on media, on having more women experts. There are plenty of them, and expanding the way we look at reality, not only through the framework of military actions, but also through a more broad and more complex and more nuanced vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. I'd like to actually go a little bit deeper into Israel-Palestine right now, just because this is such a moment of a window here. And we were, previously discussing, we're all cautiously optimistic about what it can bring. And so I'll kind of combine my two questions into one. So Maya and Hoda as well. We touched upon kind of the broad challenges for women. So we touched upon lack of security and lack of economic independence for them. But, over the past year in Israel and Palestine, we were seeing just a total absence of women at any sort of negotiating table, and also very specifically kind of like sidelining of their demands in essence. And so in your assessment, what specifically in this context prevented them from being not only heard, but included? And what were their demands? How are they adopting those from kind of pre-January to now a new scenario? In essence, what happens after they're after?
Huda, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure, there is a lack of creativity when it comes to recommendations. The real struggle is how we can push these recommendations to put them on the desk of the men who are making the decisions. Unfortunately, wars are launched and end with men and by men, and women are the ones who are losing. But women are the ones who know what it means to live in a war zone and what it means to live in a non-war zone. And I think it's no matter what we do now, and no matter how much we put effort in order to put together quote unquote smart recommendations, we keep getting a backlash from men reading these. One of the recommendations is about trauma healing. We cannot just leave this space. We cannot even do elections if we don't address the issue in Palestine, the issue of trauma. And people look at, men look at that and it's like, this is like hugging trees. It's not going to be effective. We don't think that this is important. We don't think that women need to, women are emotional. Again, they take our strength against us. Being emotional means we are smart. We know what it means to be living in these conditions. So I would say that one of the issues that we're facing in the entire world is that women in power also acting like men. And even if we want to push for recommendations coming with what we call the compassionate, the inclusive place of recommendations, we have even some women, it takes ages sometimes to reorient women in policy to think as women rather than men. So this is I would say, the cultural barrier for us, because we grow up with the mentality that it's not us who should make decisions. Decisions are made by men. And I'm not saying this is exclusive only for the MENA region. I've met women from all over the world in international conferences in which it was very difficult for them to get out of that mentality. So I would say that the opportunity is there, Faraya, but it's the fact that we cannot find gatekeepers who can push these recommendations forward, make sure that women, not just as quota, women as legitimate participants in peace building, and there is evidence that women who negotiate peace and implement peace, these agreements stand a better shot of being sustainable and successful. So why women are not there? I think the question is not only because women can't and don't have the capacity, or they are not in the room. It's because of those gatekeepers, and we need to define these gatekeepers, and we need to try and find ways in order to advocate above them, and we need to find women who think as women and like women.
Thank you. That was, very, very powerful, and you touched on, I think, the essence of it is gatekeeping. Maya, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Sure. Thank you. I'd like to turn our gaze to civil society, where there's an abundance of women, strong, impressive women, specifically in Israel before the current war, before October 7th and the war. Israel saw a very turbulent era following the judicial overhaul led by the government, and a newly formed Israeli Democratic Liberal camp. Many of the leaders are women, and these are these are women. I mean, first of all, I'll say that in general, I think for the first time, the Israeli public opinion began to engage in discourse regarding democracy, what democracy means. This is something that, for me, growing up in the United States, I remember this was a conversation. In Israel, not so much. It was sort of just a thing. It was just there. And then suddenly, once threatened, Israelis began to engage in this conversation about democracy and about rights and what it means. And a lot of the discussion had to do with women's rights and advocacy on women's rights and leadership of women. So I think we do need to turn our gaze to these women in civil society and strengthen them. And also, I'd like to, following Huda, your discussion on gatekeepers, this is key. And I just finished speaking with a group of 18-year-olds, talking to them about what reconciliation means. And I talked to them about what, the findings you mentioned, Faria, and also you, Huda, about how women's participation increases stability and makes and increases the likelihood of a peace process to stick. And what I told them is, to the young women, you need to be out there. And to the men, I said, if you are in a room, in a few years, if you are in a room where there are no women on equal basis, legitimately, you need to get out of that room. You should not be a part of it. And so I think we need to speak to the women, but also we need to speak to the men and highlight that it is not legitimate for them to continue functioning as these gatekeepers, keeping women out of the room where things happen.
Thank you, Maya. I'd like to turn now to the second sort of window of opportunity that we're seeing in the region, namely Syria. And so for that, I'll turn to Marie now, and I have a very specific question. So I'd like to ask you, kind of at the outset, we see a new caretaker government in Syria, and I think it all happened very quickly in December. And I think a lot of people were receiving mixed signals on what the future of women's inclusion in the country would be, considering HTS's track record in Idlib. However, we've seen some positive indicators like a preliminary decision that prohibited mandatory enforcement of dress, and some women leading major institutions like the bank. Considering kind of this mixed bag, how would you and how are you evaluating the path forward for women's inclusion in the country currently?
Well, it's true that there have been mixed signals. So at the moment in the caretaker government, there is only one woman who is an acting minister, and she's the head of Women Affairs, and she's very conservative. And there has been also a concerning statement from the spokesman for political affairs questioning the role of women and indicating that women couldn't be Minister of Defense, for instance. But it was immediately backtracked by the foreign minister himself, who said that the caretaker government was standing by women's cause and defending women's rights. So I think in the end, HTS knows very well that it will not be able to run Syria as it ran Idlib. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there have been some positive signs as well, as you noted. So the authorities nominated a woman as the head of the central bank, which is unprecedented. She was the deputy head before that. And also there is, for the first time, a woman who is governor of the province of Sueda in the south of the country. And this was explicitly a demand from people from Sueda. They wanted this woman to be the governor. So I think what we can take away from this, first of all, is that HTS has been nominating people they trust, people they know so far. So that's one of the reasons why there have been so many women in position. And second, that they are very attentive to the reaction of Syrians and the civil society. So that's what the comments of the foreign minister shows, and that's what the nomination of the governor of Sueda shows. So I'm reasonably optimistic. This is a positive sign. And what is also a very encouraging sign, I think it's Jihan who was mentioning the Syrian women political movement, a very inspiring movement of Syrian women that includes men, which is a great approach. They have been working very hard these past years. They have developed position papers, a white paper recently, so they are well prepared, and they can play a significant role in the transition. And that's where all the eyes are on the transition and what would be women's role there. But I really trust Syrian women to defend their position, their right, and to be very active in this important moment for Syria.
Thank you, Marie. We're closing in on the last 20 minutes, and I'd like to leave some time for some very interesting questions we've received from the audience. So I'll go through these last few questions I have, and anyone can feel free to take them. So the first thing, actually, before I turn to the open questions for Jihan, I know that the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security has a new Peace Builders initiative specifically for the Middle East region. We have a compilation of people here working from the United States, from Europe, and in the region. And so I'd like to ask you about this partnership. And what are the values that you find in convenings that gather women from the region, but also with partners outside the region? And if you have any sort of top highlights of lessons learned from this initiative.
Yes, definitely. Well, convenings that bring women together are extremely important. They create a platform for women to connect, to share best practices, to explore opportunities of collaboration and partnership amongst them. We have seen women doing amazing work on the ground. And these convenings are also a very important learning tool for the different stakeholders to listen to the women and be guided and informed by their perspectives and experiences. We have seen women on the ground talk passionately about their initiatives and the work that they do. However, they have also expressed concern that they have seen women's participation in peace talks turning into merely a checkbox exercise. Women are invited to peace and security dialogues, which is a core pillar of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, without the necessary training and preparation, which makes the participation counterproductive. It undermines their credibility and the the legitimacy of peace efforts in general. So we need to address this by investing more strategically and systematically in women's capacity building and training, to train them on negotiation skills, advocacy skills, fundraising skills. Many women have amazing ideas, as all the speakers mentioned, and they have so much passion and potential and trust in their communities, but they do not have access to financial resources. They need to be taught how to write a grant application, how to pitch their projects to donors, how to write a theory of change, a financial narrative, to be equipped with the skills that make them capable of sustaining funding streams for their projects, whether they are nonprofits or social enterprises or small businesses. Also, many women prioritize the importance of localizing the women, peace, and security agenda. And I echo what Huda mentioned, and all the panelists agreed on, that there is a gap between the local level, where women are very active, and the track one level. So we need to localize the agenda, not just in terms of mechanisms, but in terms of narratives and terminologies. Terms like feminism and gender and even empowerment can sometimes have very Western-centric and elitist connotations that can be alienating to some communities. So we need to tap more into maybe research or policy projects that explore this area, and how to make the language we use sensitive to local cultures and resonant with the local communities. And finally, I would just emphasize that there are also some unconventional entry points for women to play a role, such as faith-based approaches in contexts where religion plays a strong role. This is an approach that can help women win allies and gain acceptance to their roles in their communities. And also climate change, which is a growing challenge, and it's a natural space for women to lead. They are reservoirs of knowledge about conservation, energy, and water saving strategies, sustainable agriculture. So they are very well positioned to lead climate adaptation initiatives that educate the local community about climate change and its impacts. So there are avenues for women to engage, but I again echo what Huda mentioned, that we need to give women a safe space, and we need to get the different actors and stakeholders on board. We need more commitment from governments, civil society, and the entire international community to move forward.
Thank you, Jihan. And that transitions very nicely into my last question for the panel, which is kind of a two-part question. It's looking at sort of from the region outwards, what are sort of actionable next steps for policymakers, for instance, in the US, where the Wilson Center is based, to support the women, peace, and security agenda in the region. I know it's a bit of a difficult time but I think it's important to underline this message. So anyone is welcome to take it.
I would like to sort of also adding on the previous comments Jihan made. Thank you for that. And also with respect to your question, I think we need to, we want to see women taking part in discussions and on issues that are not necessarily women's issues. I would like to see women experts discussing security, discussing climate, as you mentioned, discussing religion. I mean, religion is perceived as a sphere where the men are the leaders and they give the tone, and maybe this is part of our problem. And if we want to see religion being used not as a force for war, but as a force for peace and reconciliation and justice, we need to bring women into these conversations as well. I come from a society in Israel, which is, everybody goes to the army. The thinking is at many times way too militaristic, dominated by men. I would like to see women taking part in these discussions on security. So I think also on the policy level, in DC and in other places in Europe, of course, I think we need to encourage women to be everywhere in discussions that are not related solely to women's issues.
Thank you, Maya. And no, I agree completely that part of transforming women's participation is also breaking down the typical separation of male versus women's leadership. Any final thoughts before I turn to the audience Q&A?
I just wanted to add the there's a certain degree of hypocrisy when it comes to women's activism all over the world. When it comes to the Middle East, we look for women who are part of the elite. They look like other women in the world and can do the work because they look in a certain way. They got their education somewhere outside the world. I think we need to change that. And when we talk about inclusivity in conflict zones, it's a survivorhood mechanism. We cannot create issues related to class, to education, and to religion in conflict zones. This is what makes people even more divided and fragmented. So, in a sense of inclusivity, women women who are not your own companion in a dinner, a woman who lives in a refugee camp, a woman who lives in a small village in Palestine. And I'm very proud of our experience because we were one of the, or maybe the only country that had a woman running against Abu Ammar. Abu Ammar is a figure, he came with all of his militaristic thinking, to peace, etc. And the first elections, the first opportunity on elections, we had a woman running against him, a woman coming from civil society. When we look at the history of women activism in Palestine, we were the biggest delegation to participate in Alexandria Women's Conference back in 1925. We were the first women's group to go against the British mandate. Was born in 1913 in Palestine. It was women from all over Palestine, from villages, from cities, from prominent to non-prominent, to educated, not educated. And I think instead of just approaching the Middle East from a place, it's just a roaming Bedouins all over the desert, and they have no culture, they have no traditions, etc., to changing that to this is a region that has rich history when it comes to almost every walk of life. We need to approach that from a place of equality rather than the upper hand. Anything that falls on women as from the sky will not be accepted. This is one of the things that I keep advocating for. If we want to do UN 1325 or women participation in the Middle East, it has to be inconsistent with the culture of the Middle East. And that's why we need to change the cultural framework that the West is approaching the Middle East with.
Thank you, Huda.
And may I add just, in our experience, search for common ground, we've managed to bring, it's not easy to create an inclusive group of women, but we've managed to do that immediately after the war when everyone stopped talking to each other. Women came together and said, this is the time for us to start acting and take things in our hands. This is the future of our children, our country, our land, and we need to talk. This is the time that we need to start talking. And at some point, we didn't have people to come on the TV to speak about analysis, etc., men because they were afraid. Women came forward. So again, it's a matter of, first of all, we need a role model. We don't have a role model when it comes to leadership. So the leadership is in a crisis mode all over the world. And action for us to take from this is we need to start developing leadership models that is rooted in inclusive practices.
Thank you, Huda.
Can I add?
Always.
Thank you. Adding to what you said, Huda, you mentioned leadership and cultivating leadership. I think one of our roles as women, because we are not gatekeepers, is enabling young people to enter the scene. I mean, it has become a custom that when discussing climate change, young people are invited because the future is theirs, and they're going to have to deal with the world and what we're leaving them. It should be the same for peace. and I think it's our obligation, but also we are the ones as women to make sure that young people are invited, because those who are the current gatekeepers don't really have the motivation to bring new people to the discussion.
Yeah. On that, actually, this somewhat leads into one of the, actually, we got a few questions that about gatekeeping, but specifically about if there is an international, or can there be really an international mechanism that would provide strong protection and support to women's inclusion in peace building. Is this something that anyone on the panel sees as a possibility? Marie, would you like to address international mechanisms?
I mean, we discussed a lot the need to localize initiatives. So I think I would spontaneously not be in favor of a blanket mechanism fit for all conflicts. And I would rather have specific mechanisms that are adapted to the context, to the local context, to the local culture, to help. And again, instead of focusing on structure and the mechanism, the structure, yeah, and this kind of bodies, it's more about the how, the linkage and the strategy to do it, and address also change behavior, and as we said, also involving men. So I think I would be more in favor of focusing on this aspect.
And then actually on the flip side, because you're right, the international mechanism, while it seems like kind of a blanket solution, would leave similar gaps in terms of the specificity of each local context and the way in which that civil society in that specific context and country interacts with the diplomatic level. And so building on that, we actually had one question specifically about Syria, but I think this can apply as well to Israel and to Palestine, about the interaction between civil society. And the question here was, given that you mentioned that HTS is attentive to civil society reactions as they're kind of moving forward, the question was on how can women's organizations engage with this group strategically to leverage potential support for rights and representation in government.
So I'm not sure if the question is about women engaging with HTS or with civil society, but I mean, I think first of all, it's as a group and with women and women's group being part of civil society group that they can have the maximum leverage. And that by making their demands clear, by pushing back against each initiative that seems unacceptable to them, and making their voice heard. Also, as I said earlier, the women political movement developing very concrete plans, roadmap, recommendations, that's extremely helpful. So I think they have had a press conference and they have shared their ideas with the international stakeholders to gather support. So that's the right way of making their ideas progress and having a voice and a role.
And Maya and Huda, do you see a similar kind of interaction in the Israel and Palestinian case in terms of the interaction between civil society, women's organizations in civil society, and their dynamic with the diplomatic level?
Extremely popular now, because again, with the unfortunate war, there has been a huge demand on women engaging in policy, which means that we need to open the diplomatic corps for them to do visits, to do, again, I agree with the fact that we need also training for them, but they do it sometimes naturally. It comes naturally to do advocacy and policy. I think it's not an issue to now, at least in Europe, there is a mandate that you need to have women participation almost in every project. But the resistance, again, for me, we need a constituency to support women's participation. And if this constituency convinced that the world is treating us unfairly and unjustly, then nothing legitimate comes from the Western world, and it actually takes away from legitimacy of women in Palestine, for sure. But I would think that also from within the MENA region, there is a foreign agenda behind any women's involvement in politics or in economy. And I would say that the solution should be, or one of the solutions is for women to be entrepreneurs also, not only economic entrepreneurs, but political entrepreneurs. Come up with their own political ideas, parties. We should give them training on how to run campaigns, political campaigns, how to be inclusive and how not to be men in politics. And that way we introduce the entrepreneurship idea to politics, because what I've noticed in the past 20 years, if women want to succeed in the economic world, they had to break away from the system and create their own system. And that's the essence of entrepreneurship. And guess what, Faraya? This is how women survived in the MENA region.
Absolutely. It's by their, own initiative and own creativity. We have very limited time left, and so I will ask one final question, because from what I'm hearing, and I think I see in the chat box that many audience members are curious about the role that international organizations can play. And so there seems to me to be a little bit of a tension between efforts to localize and empower women, and also kind of this need for international organizations to participate in financing and programming, et cetera, et cetera. And also similar to that, sometimes the backlash that international organizations' involvement can spur on women's organizations. And so considering that, I think I'd like to leave the final question as, considering that context, what is the role that international organizations play limited to capacity building and training, or is there something else and another way that they can become involved?
Maybe I can say a few words about that. I think international support is crucial, but it has to be support, not what you mentioned, like a blanket approach. It has to be support. Sometimes it can even be just creating the space to bring women together. For instance, in Israel and Palestine now, the physical spaces where Israelis and Palestinians can meet are virtually gone. So this is part of what we are doing at Search, bringing women together, Israelis and Palestinians, providing the space and letting them be their own self and represent their own local communities. This is very, very important. Also, looking forward, I'd like to stress two things. One, I think, is coalitions. Women need to partner with one another and, to form strong coalitions where we can, not only write interesting recommendations, but also really demand participation. And last point, I'll make this really brief. The world is changing. This is really, we're seeing like on a global level, many, many changes in Israel and Palestine. Hopefully the ceasefire holds and we will be able to move forward to a meaningful peace process. This means that many perceptions are going to disintegrate. And I think what we need to do internationally and locally is look for these cracks and see where we can see the cracks and work with them to bring new perspectives that will bring our perspectives in.
Thank you,
I would say that we need to be a tribe of women all over the world and change the model that we use in terms of funding to making sure that when funding is cut by a political decision, that the other group of women all over the world come together to save programs in these places. Open doors. Access is a huge issue, especially for women in conflict zones. So even a virtual meeting could be a huge success for some of women that we speak about now and with. I would say the battle in the other worlds politically speaking, is still at its beginning. I think we need more women's involvement in changing policies in Europe and in the United States when it comes to conflict zones. Not only women, but also women's issue, but also the way political decisions are affecting affecting people or the most vulnerable in conflict zones. I would also encourage all of us to change the cultural approach to the Middle East. It's important to have a dignified approach to the Middle East, not from a place that they have nothing, they have no culture, etc., rather than coming from a place they have a lot. All we need to do is to work together in order to amplify it. I would say that every woman in any position should extend a hand to another woman without looking at her appearance, background, ethnicity, etc. When a woman extends a hand to another woman, a million women can be saved. So let's keep that in mind. Keep the successful models of Liberia, Tunisia in front of us. Learn from how women with little things managed to change the politics of their countries and reclaim power within their own context.
Thank you. On that note, I'd like to thank the panelists today and also the audience for gathering for this incredibly critical discussion. Today, we've underlined the importance of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and outlined the windows of opportunity that we're seeing in the region today. Women's active participation in peace building, we know, yields positive developments and lasting developments for all of society, including the most vulnerable. Yet, its place as a key pillar of policy is not yet secure. And so we have a lot of work to do on that front. Thank you again and wishing you all a good day.